Hi, everybody. We're a couple of minutes past. It's good to be here. Michelle, I'll turn it to you to kind of
Sure.
kick it off. We're in my office here at Bio, so see a lot of familiar names. So
Excellent. Thanks so much. And we are looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you, John, for joining today's Patient Advocacy Town Hall. And we are formally introducing John Crowley in his role as CEO of Bio to the community. And any of you who may have attended the Patient Summit or certainly have been in patient advocacy for any number of time, we all know and just highly respect the work that John has done throughout the course
very kind.
over the course of his career. So I will do a quick introduction, and you can always look at bio.org to see his very detailed, very long biographical sketch. So today, John, we have with us patient advocacy organizations as well as the Bio Alliance Development Committee, so the staff level committee of Alliance Development Professionals that we work with here at Bio. John is a longtime board member and most recently founded and led Advocacy Therapeutics with a focus on rare genetic diseases. John's introduction, as he will tell us, his intro into biotech really stems from very personal experiences in 1998, which I know you were going to talk to us about, and your kid's diagnosis with Pompe disease. When your kids were diagnosed, I know that John left his position inside the industry to become an entrepreneur and co-founder of a pharmaceutical company, a biotech startup that was doing research on Pompe disease, and ultimately saw that drug through development and credits that drug with ultimately saving your kids' lives. So the 2010 motion picture Extraordinary Measures is inspired by the Crowley family, the former national chairman of Make-A-Wish Foundation, but most importantly for all of you and for all of us here at Bio, as an entrepreneur, leader, and father, you are the ultimate patient advocate, and we so appreciate you taking some time with us.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And so I'll be brief. There are many people here I know and have been part of this journey with for many years. I am now starting my third week as the CEO here at Bio, and you're very kind with that introduction, and particularly when you framed it in terms of a long biographical sketch or narrative. It's just a very polite way of saying John's getting very old.
No,
No,
that's not what
no,
I said. I
well,
didn't say anything of the sort.
that's what my children would say. That's okay. And it has been, again, like so many of us who have family members or ourselves with health challenges, whatever they may be, you come into a world of science and medicine and biotechnology that you never thought you'd be a part of. And I think that's exactly what happened to Eileen and I a long time ago now, almost 26 years to the day from when our then 15-month-old daughter, Megan, was diagnosed with Pompe disease. And a very different time back then. I mean, Google didn't even exist back then. So, going on older search engines, going to libraries to just read and learn everything we could about the disease. And there was no hope. And that was maybe the hardest thing about it, right? The doctor was an excellent caring neurologist who had never treated a child with Pompe, told us, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do. There's seems to be very little to no research into this disease, and enjoy the time you have. We set about a journey to change all of that. And, thank God for a whole lot of reasons, and because of a whole lot of people, we were able to do that. And then with Amicus to do it again for a next generation medicine, to give patients even more options and more hope. But those days, as I look back now, particularly more than a quarter of a century ago, the day of a patient, a person, a family member, a parent in an office with a doctor getting a diagnosis that can be so devastating in so many cases, those continue to happen all day, every day. But the days of, I'm sorry, there's nothing we can do, there's nobody who's working on this disease, this disorder, that's just not acceptable anymore. We really are on this cusp of a golden age of medicine. Back then there was almost nobody. There were two researchers in the world who were working on Pompeii. Now there are many, many researchers. We had no hope back then. There was maybe one technology that could work that we ultimately pushed forward. But when we look at where we are today, there's so many exciting new technologies in just that one disease, in one specific field within just the rare diseases. So when I look out more broadly at all of the challenges in human health, and the ability for science, technology, biotechnologies to address these challenges, what we need, in many ways, our greatest challenge now is one of time and the urgency of time. And I think that's going to be an important mindset for all of us who live it every day to bring to the table for people who will facilitate access to newer and better medicines, and for people or organizations or rules or laws that are slowing our progress or stopping it in some cases. We need to call that out. And we need to say that's not acceptable, that even if there is little hope because the disease is just so hard to solve for, or the technologies are just so early, let's not get in our own way. There's nothing, for so many of these disorders now, there's nothing in the laws of nature that says that we can't develop therapies, maybe even cures one day. Increasingly, it tends to be in the laws of man. And that's something we need to just shake the whole ecosystem apart and figure out what works best and how do we invest more heavily and make that work. And for things that don't work, let's reimagine. Let's reimagine the whole system. So our journey is one family and in one disease. And, we were able to make a difference there, thankfully. But, you can repeat this story countless times with so many people. And that's what I hope bio can be going ahead, is really a convener for thoughts, discussions, policy, challenges that patient organizations, that individuals broadly in the community may be struggling with. How do we highlight those issues from a policy standpoint, political standpoint when necessary, but communications and storytelling. And I'll end, Michelle, and then happy to take over, and wherever you want to go with the conversation. But when I started here 2 weeks ago, I laid out for the bio team and our board of directors, and I just did it with BioCentury in an interview over the weekend, my 7 core strategic priorities for bio. And I won't go through all of those here, but I will tell you one of the 7 that I know will hit directly here is that we need to have the organization, the industry needs to have an extraordinary focus on patients, caregivers, and families. So that if we think about, one of my other priorities is to advance what I call this virtuous circle of innovation, everything that it takes to make a new medicine or a better medicine, whether that, academic researchers, the NIH, entrepreneurs, larger companies, investment banks, capital, everything that it takes to go all around that circle. And in those rare days to actually make a medicine. And almost never is it a silver bullet cure, right? You've got to go back to the drawing board and think about how can we do it better and faster the next time. And you go around until there is a cure. But to think about that with the patient always at the center. One thing in my 19 years in starting and building Amicus, our biotech company, one thing I always asked everybody was to bring a mindset to it, and to think with every problem you're trying to solve, every program you're trying to advance. If you had that disease, or you were the mom or dad of a child of that disease, and this is something we talked about, I know, back at our patient summit, but I just want to emphasize that the importance of that mindset, what would you do? Who would you hire? Who would you talk to? Where would you invest your precious time and resources? Which programs would you start, when and where? Importantly, which would you stop? And sometimes that's the hardest thing we have to do in drug development, is know when to stop. When have we been persistent enough and have to refocus our efforts? So if we can bring that within the walls of bio, bring it with all of our partners and to everybody who is a part of that virtuous circle, that ecosystem, including everybody here in Washington, to bring it together and to really use the patient community to be the amplification for that, but also kind of the groundswell of support and ideas that you bring to us to institute. So it's something I'm excited about, and something as, parents of special children, we kind of live every day, and that's
Yeah.
something we just need to institutionalize in so many different ways. So, and there are lots of ways, people ask, how can you be patient focused? There are lots of very tangible ways you can do that, very visible signs of being patient focused. So, anyway, those are
Yeah.
my opening comments, and
Yeah.
would love to have you take us further and answer any questions, of course.
So we collected some questions in advance, but I'll ask you to start. You talked about storytelling being such an important part of what we do. Tell us your patient story, how the journey that you went through as parents.
Yeah, again, go back to the day of diagnosis, right? It was a Friday the 13th. We were
Mm.
living in California for just a year after spending most of our life in the Northeast and the Midwest. Uh, and in that neurologist office, getting that diagnosis on Megan, who was 15 months old, Patrick, who was 7 days old,
Mm.
in his car carrier, where, for Megan, she was seemingly healthy at birth, but by about 9 months of age, by a year, wasn't doing the things that a child is supposed to do, that taking the first steps, pulling up in the crib. Thankfully, Pompe never affects the mind, so cognitively, she was quite bright, precocious, but we knew something wasn't quite right, and we went from pediatrician to neurologist to blood test to scans to deep muscle biopsy.
Mm.
And they got those results where they saw this sticky form of sugar, glycogen, accumulating in her muscle. And so for so many Pompe families back then, especially, it's such a long diagnostic odyssey. In that regard, we were blessed in that pretty quickly, within months, they had the answer. And again, had Patrick, and then 7 days later was in that neurologist office to get the diagnosis, and literally told, there's nothing you can do. And I don't want to go through too much detail, but that first, I remember driving back from the doctor's office. You couldn't even look at Eileen, and Megan wasn't with us. We had Patrick in the back seat. He was sleeping, kind of a cold, rainy backdrop to the day too. And I remember going through a lot of emotions, the fear, the grief in the moment, the shock. And by that night, settling on determination, really.
Mhm.
Determined to learn everything we could, and then determined to try to meet everybody we could who might know anything about it. And again, by that point, I was less than a year out of graduate school, had 6 figures of student loans. My dad was a cop growing up in New Jersey, so we didn't have a lot of connections into the business or medical world. But, eventually we found a couple of doctors, and I went to see them. We found other patients and family members, parents in the community, and they did start to get sick. And within 6 months of that diagnosis, Megan was on a ventilator and a feeding tube, and needing a wheelchair. She was never able to walk. And 6 months after that, we went through all the same, another month in the ICU with Patrick. And so within the course of a year, to go from a seemingly normal, healthy family to a very, very different life than we had imagined. Still a very blessed life. And, to fast forward, we ended up finding the doctor, and I took a home equity loan and started a little biotech company and helped to find a medicine. Eventually, we sold that to a larger company, Genzyme. They had multiple programs and took one of those forward. And our kids started to receive that life-saving enzyme therapy in 2003. And it's an every other week enzyme therapy. And for a number of years now, they've been on a new next generation approach that Amicus had developed. And now there's multiple options for people living with Pompe. Still no cure, but a much, much brighter future, particularly for young children diagnosed with the juvenile or infantile form of Pompe, where it was just a death sentence. So transform that landscape. But again, even a year or two, Michelle, into the treatment for our kids, I realized they had plateaued in the improvements in their strength. that we needed to go back to the drawing board, kind of come around that virtuous circle. But by that point, I had learned a lot about the rare disease community and how much unmet need there was. And like, a number of other entrepreneurs, I wanted to start a company that would be an enduring, lasting company. And as Amicus is now 19 plus years, as it is, that would focus on a range of diseases. And so we did that. And looking back over 19 years, yes, we got medicines approved in Fabry disease, Pompe disease. Those were challenging, just getting them approved. And what was also challenging was all the diseases we worked in that failed. But we had written about this a couple of weeks ago. In looking back, kind of reflecting on it, we took a lot of risks. We worked in some brutally challenging and difficult diseases with enormous amounts of suffering involved for people who live with them. Diseases like epidermolysis bullosa and Batten disease and a host of others where we tried really hard, but we failed. But looking back, I would rather be the first to fail than the last to succeed. So, and that's exactly what we need. So we need a lot more companies like Amicus. We need a lot more patient advocates. I saw, just even within our rare disease community, when I had to be out of town for another event, but when I saw in Washington, the 900 plus patient advocates on Capitol Hill, it was incredibly inspiring. And this gets back to one of my 7 priorities, and that's powerful storytelling. We have to tell the story of people whose lives have been saved by the miracles of medicine, and so many more people who haven't been, or who need better medicines. Tell those stories, make this very, very human. And same with our companies, more than 70% of all new medicines come from small emerging biotechnology companies or originate there. Tell those stories. Tell the stories of failure. It's stories of entrepreneurship. So, with our journey, as I fast forward now, as I come into this role, I am excited because I hope I can have an impact on the broad ecosystem. And I hope within our industry, we can elevate the patient perspective again to just an extraordinary level so that we all live it. At Bio here, we're going to be doing, you and I have been planning and we'll start implementing here in April. We're shooting for twice a month patient visits, lunch and learn. So I'm sure be speaking with many of you to come in and tell your stories, your journeys, something we did hundreds of times at Amicus and had an incredible impact on the culture and giving purpose and meaning and inspiration to people's work, and really tying in, whether it's policy or the political end of what we do at Bio, or fostering the economic world that needs to exist to bring resources, money to these R&D programs. That's something we need to do within Bio, and we need to do it outside of Bio. We need to do it up on the Hill, and we need to do it locally throughout the country. We do a lot of these Bio fly-ins to go talk on Capitol Hill. We need to do the fly-outs. And if we do, I think we could really move the needle, because just these incremental improvements are not going to be sufficient. And I look at our family's journey now, and our kids, Megan and Patrick are still in wheelchairs, on ventilators, and feeding tubes. But you look at Megan, who ended up going to college and graduated Notre Dame in 2019 and earned her master's in social work at UNC Chapel Hill a couple of years ago, and is now a social worker with the Make-A-Wish Foundation. So her way of giving back as well. So it's all part of our journey in life, I guess.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that. And I get chills every time you share your family story. And it's you're so I don't know, you're sort of humble about, oh yeah, I started a biotech and discovered a treatment and did all these things which were seem like enormous mountains to climb. But the power of your patient story and your family experience, of course, just really are so inspiring to many of us.
Very kind, but again, you could tell a million of these stories.
Yeah. So thinking about what brought you to Bio, you've been on the board for a long time. We knew that Rachel King was here as an interim CEO. So what brought you here?
Yeah, I'd been a board member for years, and then actually rose to become the vice chair at Bio. And, I was actually co-leading the search committee with Ted Love, and we Horn Ferry, the search firm, was out looking for candidates. Before that, we had done a lot of listening. We did one with the bio team here. We did one with our board, a series of sessions, kind of came up with our ideal profile for a CEO. They looked at, I think they screened over 200 candidates. We interviewed as a committee about a dozen, and it just wasn't striking where we wanted. And so through a series of conversations, I myself and Ted Love and the search committee, and then eventually the board, as I thought about it, I thought, as I think about kind of the next chapter in life where I can have an impact. I would never run another biotech company. We've done that very intensely. I don't know that it could ever be better or more challenging than Amicus was. But thinking about where I can have a broad impact and bring both the entrepreneur focus and the patient perspective focus. And it's something I became very excited about. And Eileen and Megan and the rest of the family kind of blessed it, and in fact kind of encouraged it for me to get out of the home more, I guess. But and the board was very supportive. So this is something we've been excited about. I've had about 2 months since the announcement to do a lot of homework, talk to a lot of people, come up to speed on a lot of issues, Michelle, and started 2 weeks ago. So the one thing I told the board is that, we're going to reimagine everything we do and every way we do it. And that, for me, the core of that, again, is going to be this extraordinary focus on patients, caregivers, and families, and interactions with the patient community in a really true partnership.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. As we thought about coming into today and the kinds of questions we got in advance, there are so many of them, but you touched on exploring your molecule, the drug in Fabry, in addition to Pompe. Was that the same molecule?
No, totally different. That was actually a small molecule precision medicine that the company was founded on, the original technology. We had tried it actually in Pompe and it failed. We tried related but different molecule in Gaucher disease, it failed. Fabry took a long time. I mean, this drug that now helps thousands of people as a treatment option living with Fabry, it was really hard. We had to get the dosing, the pharmacology, the genetics. There's more than 1,000 mutations in Fabry. So understanding which mutation would or would not respond to the precision medicine. It took from first in man, which was healthy volunteer study we started at the end of 2005. Took 11 years till it was approved in Europe, 13 years from that point till it was approved in the United States. Upwards of $1 billion of research and development to do that. And, I'm glad we were persistent. I think it helps a lot of people. And it's just great for patients and doctors to have more options. And then we're going to get to the point where, I hope, with so many of these diseases, that there's an array of options. And it's tailored to a person's individual symptoms and their genetics and combinations of therapies and combinations at different times in their life. But, to have this vast array of options is going to be so important. And it gets to another one of my 7 priorities, and that's to identify and break down barriers to access. Let's make sure no one should ever go a day without their medicines. So let's figure out why they're not. Is it because of co-pays, deductibles, co-insurance, or the economics of delivering drugs to patients? Let's think about that. Is it because of education? They're just not aware. Because I was in North Carolina Thursday, and one of the patient advocates there told a story in one of the rare diseases, how she came to meet a family and they had a young child with a rare disease where there isn't very effective available therapy. And the doctor had just found out about it, but there was, I think, a 7-year-old sibling just devastated by the disease who didn't need to be, because the local physician combined with the family and their lack of knowledge, they just didn't know, and that should never happen. So what can we do to think about education? Areas where we're underinvesting broadly, take women's healthcare. You look at, not just things specific to women, whether it's postmenopausal diseases or breast or cervical cancer or postpartum depression. Just look at autoimmune diseases that greatly disproportionately impact women and the vast amount of underinvestment in diseases that affect women. So we need to change that because that directly affects access, innovation, but access as well. So these are the things we're going to focus on.
So, so thank you so much for that. Annie Kennedy, who is out on spring break with Declan, did send a couple questions
good.
in advance. So
Miss Annie.
I'll go ask you those. If you have questions for John, please put them in the Q&A function. And those will queue up over here on my iPad, and then I can ask them of John. So her question, she says, 2024 has been a milestone year for the rare disease community with the 40th anniversary of the Orphan Drug Act, implementation of the user fee agreement, and historic milestones in product development. But it's also been a year in which we have continued to experience the erosion of critical incentives to the development of these innovative therapies. Many communities, pipelines have suffered from untenable regulatory hurdles, and we continue to face increasingly complex access challenges once products are approved. So her question is, through your unique lens as a leader in rare product development and a member of the rare community, what do you consider the most urgent priorities before us as a community?
Yeah, I think if you look at the big issue too, there have been over 200 rare disease programs in academia and in biotech companies that have been canceled or effectively delayed forever in just the last 2.5 years. And again, that's something that's not acceptable. You get all this great science wanting to move forward, but companies are starved for access to capital. Foundations can't support enough of the core research. Academic programs sometimes are getting deprioritized. So we just need to acknowledge that problem and say, okay, this is a huge issue. How do we fix that? Because, at the current pace, it's going to take, at last I saw, something like 150 years to just get to 50% of the rare diseases. And that's nonsense. That can't be. So when I look at the challenges, I think number one is go to the Inflation Reduction Act. There were some good parts of that Inflation Reduction Act. There were two areas, though, one misinformed and one was just a mistake. The mistake was limiting exclusivity. So if you have one drug for one orphan disease, you're exempted from kind of the government pricing mechanisms here, which will encourage incentives and investment. But if you take that drug or technology and you get it approved, in fact, not even just approved, you get an orphan designation, even preclinical, you will lose that orphan protection. So that just means no one's ever going to get follow-on indications. And about 20-25% of all rare disease drugs have been applied to other indications. And now with new technologies, so many different areas you can look into see where there could be, where you could transfer these medicines and technologies. We need to change that. I get what they were trying to do in the act. They were trying to prevent somebody gaming the system or somebody, okay, that's kind of cute. You got it for an orphan drug, but what you really care about is that massive population and billions of revenues. So don't game the system, which is fine. But there's ways to craft the legislation to make sure the system is not gamed or gamed, but to also make sure that you've got the right incentives. Because right now it's a massive disincentive. And it's not just rare diseases, it affects oncology very broadly as well, too. So orphan cures is important. For Annie and in the rare disease community, I think looking at regulatory science where we are, we had a great session 3 weeks ago, the Reagan-Udall Foundation sponsored here. It brought together all the companies and all the key researchers involved in Sanfilippo disease, MPS III. And they were all stuck. They were stuck in particular on whether, a particular substrate, disease-causing substrate, could qualify as a biomarker for accelerated approval. It was a great session. We highlighted big picture issues around it, but you brought all the best minds together with FDA leading minds together to look at the science, look at the data, and to kind of make informed decisions from there. But it really did highlight, in some ways, the lack of regulatory consistency and frankly, sometimes the lack of regulatory expertise, where we've got, science and medical technologies that are taking, orders of magnitude leaps forward, but regulatory science isn't. Some diseases, we do clinical studies the same way we did them 30, 40, 50 years ago. We need to reimagine all of that. So to think about what they should do, I think, is to think about each disease and each molecule individually on a case-by-case benefit, benefit risk assessment. And that's going to require opening up all the tools that the FDA already has. When do you use historical controls instead of placebo controls, which are oftentimes difficult to enroll and oftentimes just unethical? When do you use accelerated approval? More and more. Peter Marks, thankfully, was a great leader at FDA and CBER. Peter just said recently that accelerated approval will be the standard and the norm in biologics, at least. Now we need to extend that to all medicines where, you're looking at surrogate markers, for instance, that are reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes, look what happened just now with my friends at Amylyx. They tried really hard in ALS. There was a lot of hope. And they, a couple of adcoms and they get a medicine approved. And now the studies, the confirmatory studies fail. And that's challenging too. And again, to try to think, sometimes we take smart risks and better to do something to then follow the science. And then if something doesn't work, patients won't take it, doctors won't write the scripts. Some cases maybe even be withdrawn from the market. So that's just one of many, many examples of where there is such unmet need and we take risks. And sometimes, thankfully, we take smart risks, as we did in COVID with vaccines, where we didn't lower the bar. They needed to be safe, they needed to be effective, but we realized we needed them urgently and we needed them for everybody. And we needed to break the mold of how we did drug development, how we partnered with regulators. So Orphan Cures Act specifically take a look at the broad field of how we think about regulations, regulatory science, without lowering the gold standard, but putting in regulatory sophistication and consistency will be incredibly important.
And I know many of the folks on the line are also working really hard on the pediatric, the rare pediatric priority review voucher has to be renewed.
That comes up in what, a year or so,
September
2
30th.
years.
So
I'm sorry, the end of this fiscal year.
Yeah. So, and so thank you to all the advocates who are working so hard on that.
Critically important.
And the importance of that to the emerging companies with all of these innovations, where 70% of the therapies are originating. The meaning of that.
There are countless programs that the only way they could justify any investment in some of the very rarest of rare diseases is because of the existence of the PRV program.
So a couple of questions have come in. I think we've given a teaser on your 7 priorities, and someone has asked if you could just outline them, if you would be willing to do so.
Sure. I'll try to be pretty brief. So and again, these are necessary. They're all interdependent, particularly the 6 of the 7 in human health. But the first, I described the first one, advance the virtuous circle of innovation. And what that means is think about any part of that activities on the circle, whether it's funding at the NIH, levels of funding, whether it's academic activities, whether it's the intellectual property world, whatever it may be, that if one of those nodes is not working right, that we focus together on that. So it's the entire virtuous circle of innovation. The second is to identify and break down barriers to access, and we talked about that as well. Third is powerful storytelling. We've got to get back the narrative of just how important biotechnology broadly, and not just the industry, the entire ecosystem is, how vitally important this is to us. And we're going to do that by humanizing the industry. Again, the stories of people in need still, people who have had, medical miracles save or change their lives, entrepreneurs, patient organizations, how this comes together. The fourth point is, again, this extraordinary focus on patients, caregivers, and families. The fifth is, and this has been quite a topic for the last couple of weeks, many of you may have seen, and it's something I and the board now are very passionate about, and that is the importance of advancing biotechnology as a national security imperative for the United States. Biotechnology and the broad biomedical research field is a core strategic asset for the United States and for our allies, for the benefit of not just American citizens, but ultimately everybody in the world. And that's something that we need to make sure that any legislation that comes up, the next IRA, the next cut to whatever programs, people think, does this harm innovation? Does this harm biomedical research? And look at it through the national security lens. Yes, certainly for patients and companies and all of that, but biotech is a national security imperative. Sixth is to expand our engagement, expand and engage with our core members, our membership, the companies that belong and the associate members at Bio, but also the broad stakeholders. So, regulators, funders, philanthropists, patients, patient organizations. So expand and engage that relationship. And the last is an important part. You're starting to see a convergence of biotechnologies from human health to food and agriculture, environment, climate impact. So the last priority is ensure that people understand the importance of biotechnology for food security and climate impact as well, too. So those are my 7 priorities. And we can, maybe Michelle, if we could send them around for sure, but also to Steve Usden at BioCentury. I did an interview with the other day and just published a day or 2 ago. Maybe we can send that piece.
Sure.
My kids got a kick out of the title. Was it Mr. Crowley Comes to Washington or something like that?
Yeah, wonderful. So, so Pam Squires has a question. She's with the Eosinophilic and Rare Diseases Cooperative. As a patient advocacy organization in rare disease, we see that even when we do have new medications, you touched on this, physicians are not prescribing. And you just mentioned this. Are there ways we can work more closely with Bio to address this barrier to access medications more easily? And what ideas do you have in that arena? And Pam, we will definitely be asking you to help us with those ideas.
Yeah, essential. And again, that's where Bio can really sit at the crossroads of so much of this, because, we touch all the different parts of the ecosystem, and we've got pretty substantial resources to move the needle. In some of these diseases, it's just, you've got to change the practice of medicine. And that's partly on the patient community. It's in large part on the company, the sponsor of the drug, and they've got every reason to want to educate and change treatment paradigms. Make sure it's driven with data, driven with science, not fancy commercials or ads. And I think you'll find that too. And we're blessed in the rare disease community. We're more often than not, these are very serious physicians and very well informed. Many of them are physician scientists, so they're receptive to following the data. But that's not always the case with every rare disease. And it's certainly not the case more broadly with human health. So it's physician education, changing medical treatment paradigms. It's also working to, in the communities. And that's something we could do. You look at the healthcare disparities. You take a look at the life expectancy here in America. And of course, now with COVID, you've seen that we've gone backwards. It's going to take a generation to catch up. Well, that's if you are in areas where you have access to medicine, cutting edge, geographically, socioeconomically, racially, and all of those together, your life expectancy, you're doing really, really well. But you go down all those different classifications and they really, really struggle too. So that's a unique role that Bio can play. And that's where we talk about Bio as innovation. I mean, it's in our name now, Biotech Innovation Organization, but it has to be equally about access. And you'll see a very large focus on that as well.
Thank you. So Dr. Hu, Mike, I see your hand is up. I don't know, are you able to unmute yourself, or Jet, can you unmute him? Tell us a little bit. I think you'll have to explain Project Guardian to folks, but and then ask your question of John.
Thank you, Michelle. Mike Hu. And I want to first take the time to say thank you to John. You have been such an inspiration to parent advocates like me. You showed us what we can do. So I talked with Michelle before about Project Guardian. We are a nonprofit. We're trying to use genomic sequencing based newborn screening to change the landscape for drug development as well as for patient care. Now, my question is about that. Thank you, Michelle, for catering that to us. John, I think you've talked about the focuses. I want to ask you, how do you view newborn screening in the bigger picture for rare disease drug development, and how do you see that fitting with Bio's strategic focus for the next few years?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Thanks for the kind words too up front. I think this is going to be critically important. This is all about access, right? What a tragedy it is when a child is born and there is an existing treatment, but also too for diseases that don't have treatments, to understand how many people could potentially benefit. It helps biotech companies when they're building their investment thesis and to attract more capital. So for a whole bunch of reasons, it's going to be really important. And this is an area where biotech has not, or bio has not typically played a significant role. So I'd love to partner with you and others. I look, in our rare disease community, I look at, Rod Howell going back many years, a good friend, Dr. Howell, and others who were champions of this 20 plus years ago. Ultimately, it's a complex issue. You've got the RUSP, of course, and then you've got a state by state decision. And I've learned over the years, there's lots of politics, there's economics involved. But again, that's okay, break down those barriers or those sub barriers. What do we need to do? And what can the power of this organization bring to the table? We've got great relationships with all of our state biotech associations. I've gone out and met with state legislators over the years where some of this was pending for specific diseases. And we should find a way to really highlight this, maybe make it a focal point of what we're doing on access as well. We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go still.
And the unique angle for Mike and his organization, you're really looking at genetic based newborn screening, which is a totally new frontier. In traditional genomic screening, newborn screening, I know that the advocacy of your organization and so many others on the line really made sure that Indiana, for example, understands the importance of newborn screening. And certainly many of you have had stories around newborn screening. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I look at, I think, Texas, for instance, Mike, was way behind the curve for many, many years. And now they've really kind of jumped the curve, I think. So I think a lot of the newborn screening comes into play here very, very quickly in Texas with the legislation that was passed. Other areas too, you find, I think we saw this in New Jersey maybe, where this goes back to like when Chris Christie was governor, where we had legislation passed, but I think it didn't come, or for a period of time at least, didn't come with the appropriate funding, so they couldn't implement it. And then even once you implement it, how do you educate? How do you disseminate? And then oftentimes, like we saw in Pompe, finding many, many more people with Pompe mutations, then it's up to the physicians and the families to determine is intervention, is therapy necessary, and at certain points, because in Pompe, we were finding people with, what are oftentimes more late onset mutations and questions about whether treatment would be appropriate sooner or later. But that ultimately is a question for the doctor and the family.
So another question, and Max, I see your question, but I'm prioritizing the questions that are coming in from the patient community first. Sarah Jones, who was referred to us with the Parkinson's and Movement Disorder Alliance, she is very close with Ron Cohen, Dr. Ron, who is on our board of directors. And he is definitely a rock star. So Sarah's question essentially gets at all of these converging pressures on the patient community, and certainly on us as innovators, whether you're thinking about PBMs, prior authorizations, step therapy, being forced to go through, what we know is most likely a less efficacious therapy, but it's on the formulary. All of these issues really converging, and Sarah's question is around how your organization, how PMDA and others can really focus on how do you prioritize education for your members and policymakers. And I certainly think about all of the leadership that you have brought to bear, and the different audiences that we all have influence in. So the patient community, I think, for Sarah, I get to your question. You talked about, there are so many great patient advocacy alliances like the Safe Step Coalition and others that are working on these issues. But I really like your comments earlier about bio as a convener, really bringing together these really patient advocacy driven coalitions and conversations so that we can move the needle. So I think about various opportunities.
Yeah. Well, I think that comes back definitely under the whole umbrella of access. What does it mean? Again, all these great new medicines are going to be meaningless until we have universal access. So roadblocks that are put up, I would kind of put them in two categories. One that have a substantive negative effect on patients, meaning they never get medicines or they're getting the wrong medicines. That those, whether it's the requirements for certain characteristics or mutations or things that are put in the label by FDA that then make it difficult to ever get insurance reimbursement. Those, we should just be identifying them. Again, for me, it's about identification and breaking down barriers. And some of these are pretty high on the list of priorities. The other bucket that I would put it in is time. Things that are just a waste of effort, waste of time, where people unnecessarily still have to struggle without access to the best therapy. And in some of these diseases where the consequences are irreversible. So, again, when you think about prior auths and step therapies, and some of these diseases I see, the step therapies that are required are nonsense. I mean, you have to try this drug that we all know doesn't work, that was approved 40 years ago for 6 months. And then that's just crazy. But if we can highlight that from both a policy standpoint and a storytelling standpoint, we can not only have identified the problem, but come up with ways to affect change there. And that's what storytelling ultimately is, right? You look at every great story ever told, it's about an individual or a community in need, people who came up and did something pretty extraordinary in many cases, and something was changed because of that. And that's kind of all it is at its core.
Thank you. And certainly, Sarah, connect with our team and we can help you as well. You've been such a great partner on the Save Rare Treatments Coalition and others. So next question, Shri Thacker has a question. As a patient advocacy organization for limb loss and limb difference with intersection points across many rare diseases, and knowing BIO's commitment to this, what are your thoughts on how to further increase inclusion of people with disabilities in research and education dissemination to increase inclusion criteria and subsequent increased access?
Yeah, I think just identifying each community, who are oftentimes in particular diseases, it's the people who have been, struggling with the disease longest or have the more severe forms of it. And it's often hard too, if you're a biotech company and they're a minority of the population and sometimes a very small sliver of it, you don't have an incentive to really study those patients, to get them access, to get them, ultimately their data in the label so it can get out to a broader population, be reimbursed. I would just, and this is a role, again, I think bio can uniquely play, as patient advocacy groups highlight the needs of people with, disabilities broadly, physical disabilities, cognitive, and make sure that when we talk about equity and inclusion in clinical studies and access to medicine, it includes people, who are among the most weak and vulnerable of us, right, with disabilities. We, at Amicus, our very first phase 1/2 study, a lot of times you're looking at muscle diseases at 6-minute walk, which means you're going to be studying people who can still walk, ambulatory patients. We were adamant that we also, in that first exploratory study, we include people who are wheelchair bound. And there are different endpoints. You got to work harder, you got to invest more. It was great that we did for those individuals, but it also made our program and the data from that program much more robust. So it's there. I think you can have perfectly aligned interests, but you've got to just highlight it. So thanks for bringing that question.
Another question from Victoria Arteaga with the Society for Hispanic Rare Diseases. In your perspective, what will be the most important strategies to effectively engage diverse communities in biotech? And maybe you could talk a little bit at least about our initial foray with the Women's Health Initiative.
Sure. So at a very large scale, we've just put together a task force at Bio made up of Bio board members on women's healthcare. So I talked a little bit about why that's so important. So we'll be calling out some of the specifics and, diseases that disproportionately affect the Latina communities are going to be very important. I'm thinking about, I'm envisioning community engagement managers geographically with other key stakeholders in some areas, like in the African American community, through churches, and certainly through any of these foundations that are focused. So I wasn't familiar with the Hispanic Rare Disease Association. Is that Society for Hispanic Rare Diseases, Victoria? So I'd love to learn a lot more about that as well.
Excellent. And Jet on our team is working closely with you all, so that's exciting.
Great.
Okay, so another question from the rare community. I think this is a fresh question because folks saw your BioCentury article, and you mentioned wanting to really make very visible displays of just our commitment and our heart and what we want to focus on the patient. And so one of the advocates asked, would you be willing to feature artwork from our art program?
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I'm actually envisioning, as we have a lot of empty walls here and some other artwork that's nice but not relevant to our mission. Unlike at Amicus, where we would engage folks to go out and meet patients and take specific portraits, that's been done in so many foundations and companies. Let's just take that here. Someday, we'll get to having our own maybe proprietary storytelling and artwork. But part of that is going to be the actual artwork that people themselves create. I've seen some beautiful displays over the years, particularly, in where I'm more familiar in the rare disease community. Some of the artwork, some of them are permanent, some of them are just traveling displays, some of them are tied to specific individual storytelling and folks in. So I'm open to all of that. So yeah, if you guys have specific pieces of art or pictures or anything you'd like included here, that's one thing, we don't have a shortage of office space. So
just reach out and we can chat and brainstorm with you all. So okay, so there is a question in the chat about the role of geopolitics, sort of global biosecurity, and wondered if you wanted to chat a little bit about that. So it's from Max Bronstein, who is now with
hi, Max.
Crinetics. He congratulates you on your new role.
Oh, thanks. Matt's been a great advocate and leader. Yeah.
And, he's asking you to comment on the role of geopolitics and national security on drug development. How could recent issues regarding China impact drug development for the industry? And is there a role for patients and/or patient advocates to play?
Yes. So this kind of landed on my desk literally day one here, and it's around the Biosecure Act that was passed a couple of weeks ago, 11-1 vote, very bipartisan, out of the Senate Homeland Security Committee. It was highlighted in the Select Committee on China Relations in the House that Congressman Gallagher is the chair of as well. And, for years, many of us have been saying that we are losing our advantage in biotechnology in the United States and among our allies. We are losing particularly the biomanufacturing centers of excellence, the capacity, the capabilities to make these medicines. And we can't have that. We need this, I articulated biotechnology as a national security imperative. It's that important. We need it to project power abroad. We need it for public health. We need it for pandemic preparedness, the things I had mentioned. So this kind of came to a head of sorts a few weeks ago with those committee votes. And we realized that, bio, I think, needed to take a much more proactive and affirmative stance. Thankfully, it aligned with the priorities that I had just days earlier internally articulated about national security. So that's kind of at the forefront, the importance and the preeminence of biotechnology and the biomedical research field for national security. Now, with that said, it's a very complex industry, a lot of interdependencies, particularly on the manufacturing supply chain. It's a truly global supply chain that so many companies and ultimately so many patients rely on. So it's important that lawmakers, policymakers understand just how vastly integrated and how complex those work streams are in those industries today. And that if we're going to, have a decoupling of sorts and a reinvestment, significant reinvestment in biotech, particularly biomanufacturing in the United States, we just need to be very thoughtful about it. And so the point we will continue to make is to policymakers on the Hill is, like in medicine, first rule is do no harm. So to understand the impact, we're going to go out here very shortly, and Bio is going to lead an effort to do a survey of the industry. And we'll also reach out to patient groups as well for, and again, a couple of, one in particular, contract manufacturer was named that does very, very high quality work around the world for the industry, but it's been expressed as a potential area of concern. We need to understand the magnitude of the work, how many contracts, how many companies involved, what are the dollar amounts involved, what are the diseases that are reliant on that supply chain, all the way down to how many patients are affected, whether they're preclinical programs that could be delayed or late stage development or approved programs where access to medicine could be at risk for patients. So that's where it was important that we come out with a very strong and affirmative statement, because it's the right thing and the right thing to do, but it also ensures our credibility when we talk about kind of the complexities of the supply chain and making sure that no patients are harmed. So if there's anything specific, Max or anybody on the call that you're aware of as we go out, we're hoping by the end of April or so to have all that data collected, have it synthesized, to put together some case studies so that we can use that for conversations on the Hill in particular about what we need to do. But then also in parallel, make sure we describe for people policies, programs that we think at the federal and each state level will be important to ensure that we continue to grow and invest in biotech, particularly biomanufacturing. So.
Excellent. Well, we are right at 3:00. Thank you so much for engaging and being part of the conversation. We will send a follow-up email with the link to this conversation today.
Great.
So your friends and others who were not able to join us can do so virtually. So thank you again, and we will look forward to our next coffee chat.
Yeah, thank you, and looking forward to spending time with each of you here. Everybody's welcome at Bio.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Thanks, Michelle.